People think forests are scary at night because of the darkness. That's not true. At Raven Creek, darkness isn't the problem. The problem is that after nightfall, something wakes up. My name is Aaron Blake. I've been a ranger assigned to Raven Creek for 9 years. Raven Creek isn't famous. No crowded campsites. No scenic lookout posts on social media. Just dense trees, old trails that don't see much use anymore, and a narrow creek that cuts straight through the forest like a scar. During the day, it feels normal, quiet, peaceful. At night, the forest doesn't get louder, it gets aware. There's an unwritten rule among rangers here, one you won't find in any official handbook. After nightfall, you don't respond inside Raven Creek. When I first heard that rule, I didn't take it seriously. I thought it was just superstition. Old stories meant to scare new rangers into being cautious. I learned the truth my first winter on duty. It was 12:32 a.m. when my radio came alive. No static, no interference, just a clear voice. "Ranger, is anyone there? I think I took the wrong trail." The voice sounded young, nervous, completely real. My hand moved toward the radio before I even thought about it. Then I remembered what my supervisor told me on my first day. After dark, Raven Creek doesn't lose people, it keeps them. I didn't respond. The radio crackled again. "Please, I'm near the creek. I feel like someone's watching me." My blood ran cold, because the location he described was the exact place where a ranger disappeared 3 years earlier. No body, no struggle, just his radio left on the creek bank. I listened. For nearly an hour the voice came and went, begging, whispering, sometimes just breathing. Then the tone changed. "You're listening," the voice said calmly. "I know you are." It was my voice, perfect, flat, identical. I stepped back from the radio. It shut off by itself. At sunrise, a search team checked the area. There was no lost hiker, no signs of a struggle, just footprints along the creek's edge, bare footprints, human-shaped. But the toes were wrong, too many. That was the night I stopped doubting the rule. After nightfall, Raven Creek doesn't want help, it wants attention. Years later, a new ranger named Mark was transferred in. Young, confident, didn't believe in ghost stories. He laughed when we warned him. "Forests don't wake up," he said. "People just panic." That same night, at 1:07 a.m., Mark's radio went off. "Ranger down," the voice said, "near the Raven Creek Bridge." Mark answered immediately. "I'm on my way." I tried to stop him. He shrugged. "If someone's hurt, I'm not ignoring it." Mark drove into the forest. He never came back. We found his truck parked near the bridge, engine cold, doors closed. No blood, no footprints, just his radio lying on the ground. Sometimes after midnight, that radio still turns on. "Aaron," it says, "you still on duty?" I never answer, because Raven Creek doesn't kill you, it replaces you. After nightfall, something wakes up here. It listens, it learns voices. It waits for someone kind enough, or brave enough, or tired enough to respond. So if you ever find yourself near Raven Creek, and the forest suddenly goes quiet after dark, don't stop, don't listen. And if you hear your name being called, understand this. Whatever is calling you isn't lost. It's trying to make sure you are. The forest starts using familiar voices. After Mark disappeared, Raven Creek changed. Not in a way you could measure, not in a way reports could capture. It felt closer, like the forest had leaned in. We closed the bridge area officially, put up warning signs, redirected trails. Unofficially, every ranger knew the truth. Whatever woke up at Raven Creek had learned something new that night. It learned that some people would answer. For weeks after Mark vanished, the radios stayed silent after midnight. That scared us more than the calls ever had, because silence meant observation. The next call came on October 19th at 12:46 a.m. I was alone at the station finishing paperwork when the radio turned on, not with a distress call, with a check-in tone, the exact tone Mark used at the end of every shift. Then his voice. "Aaron," he said casually, "can you confirm my log? I think I missed a timestamp." My hands went cold. Mark had been gone for 11 days. No body, no trail, no evidence he'd survived more than an hour in the forest. I didn't respond. The voice continued, relaxed, familiar. "Come on, man. You're still mad about the bridge thing? It remembered arguments we'd had, jokes we'd shared, details Mark had never spoken over the radio. That's when I realized something important. Raven Creek wasn't just copying voices anymore, it was copying relationships. The call ended abruptly. At dawn, we checked the bridge area again. Nothing new, but something old was missing. Mark's footprints, preserved in dried mud for days, were gone, cleanly erased, as if the ground itself no longer needed them. After that night, we changed another rule. We stopped saying names over the radio. No first names, no nicknames, no personal details. We spoke like strangers, because familiarity gave it material. The following nights were worse. The calls didn't beg. They didn't scream. They sounded reasonable, like coworkers checking in, like supervisors asking for updates, like friends making sure you were okay. One ranger swore he heard his wife's voice ask if he was almost done with work. She was at home, asleep. Another heard his own voice reporting an injury that hadn't happened. The forest wasn't luring people with fear anymore. It was using routine. That's harder to resist. I started noticing patterns. The calls never came when someone was moving, driving, walking, talking. They always came during pauses. When paperwork was finished, when engines were off, when you were alone and still. Raven Creek didn't want panic, it wanted permission. Late one night, I tested something. At 11:58 p.m., I left the radio on and paced the room, no calls. At 12:01 a.m., I sat down, stopped moving. The radio clicked. "Aaron," a voice said softly, "you can rest now." It wasn't Mark's voice. It wasn't mine. It was neutral, calm, inviting. I stood up immediately. The radio went silent. That's when the truth finally clicked. Raven Creek doesn't hunt people. It waits for them to stop hunting themselves. The forest doesn't force you out. It waits for you to choose stillness. That's how Mark disappeared. That's how the first ranger vanished years ago. They didn't run into danger. They stood still long enough for something else to step forward. The administration still calls it stress, auditory hallucinations, sleep deprivation, but they also quietly approved something new. Mandatory noise at night. Radios playing static. Lights left on, engines idling. Silence was officially labeled a risk factor. And still, it waits. Because Raven Creek has learned patience. It knows someone will eventually stop moving, stop questioning, stop resisting the quiet. And when that happens, it won't need to call for help anymore. It will already be standing close enough to speak without one. When the calls no longer need radios. After the forest started using familiar voices, we thought we understood the danger. We were wrong. Raven Creek wasn't adapting to our rules. It was outgrowing them. The first sign came 3 weeks after Mark's disappearance. I was off duty at home miles away from the forest. My service radio was locked in my truck, turned off. At 12:04 a.m., I heard a sound I hadn't heard outside of work in years. A radio check in tone. Not loud, not echoing, perfectly clear. It came from my kitchen. I froze in bed, listening. Then a voice followed. "Aaron, you forgot to log the creek patrol." It was my supervisor's voice. The same calm irritation, the same pacing. He was alive, at home, not calling me. I didn't answer. I didn't move. I remembered another unwritten rule older rangers used to joke about. If the forest talks to you without equipment, it already knows you too well. The sound stopped, but after that night I wasn't the only one. Another ranger reported hearing dispatch through his car's speakers while the engine was off. One heard footsteps matching his own pace while walking alone at night. Until he stopped and they didn't. He didn't. The pattern was clear. Raven Creek no longer needed radios. It had learned how we listen. That's when we realized something terrifying. The forest wasn't tied to sound. Sound was just the easiest doorway. What it really wanted was attention. Names, familiarity, stillness. Silence wasn't absence. It was an invitation. A week later, I returned to the station for a night shift I didn't want. At 11:57 p.m., everything felt normal. At 12, the air changed. Not colder, heavier. The kind of pressure you feel before a storm, without clouds. I stood in the hallway, listening. Nothing. Then, from behind me, footsteps, bare, wet, stopping when I stopped. I didn't turn around. I walked faster. The footsteps followed. When I reached the radio room, the sound stopped. The lights flickered. And then I heard it, my own voice, not S. Peeking, breathing, right behind my ear. I bolted into the room and slammed the door. Nothing followed. At dawn, I checked the hallway. The floor was dry, except for one thing. A single wet footprint, bare, human-shaped, but the heel was wrong. Too long. That footprint didn't lead anywhere. It didn't need to. After that night, I stopped pretending retirement meant escape. Rangers who transferred out reported the same thing weeks later. Calls in dreams, voices during moments of rest, a sense of being watched whenever they were still too long. Raven Creek wasn't a location anymore. It was a condition, a way of listening, and once you learned it, you couldn't unlearn it. The administration quietly added a final guideline, not written, not announced. If you start hearing voices without equipment, you leave the region entirely. New town, new noise, new routine. Silence had become the real threat. Because Raven Creek doesn't chase people. It waits for them to stop. And once someone does, once they listen long enough to feel recognized, the forest doesn't need to call. It's already standing close enough to speak, the section of forest we closed forever. The problem with Raven Creek was that eventually someone always tried to understand it, not escape it, not ignore it, understand it. That someone was Daniel Mercer. Daniel wasn't reckless. He wasn't arrogant. He was analytical. Former wildlife biologist turned ranger. He believed that anything repeating patterns could be studied. Fear doesn't protect us, he said. Knowledge does. We warned him. Everyone did. But Daniel believed the forest wasn't malicious, just misunderstood. He volunteered to take over the North Bend sector, the oldest part of Raven Creek. The place where trails stopped appearing on maps. The place where radios lost signal before midnight. The place we unoffic. Iley called the listening zone. Daniel went in during daylight, cameras mounted, GPS active, 2 radios. He planned to leave well before dark. At 5:11 p.m., he checked in. All clear, he said. Quiet. No anomalies. At 6:02 p.m., he paused. I feel like the sound is wrong, he said, like the forest is absorbing it. We told him to turn back. He said he would. At 6:40 p.m., Daniel stopped responding. No distress call, no static, just silence. We waited for daylight. That was the rule. At sunrise, 3 of us entered North Bend. The forest looked untouched. No broken branches, no disturbed soil. Daniel's backpack sat neatly against a tree. His radios were placed beside it, turned off. The cameras were still recording. When we reviewed the footage, we understood why North Bend would never reopen. For the first 2 hours, nothing happened. Daniel walked, documented, talked to himself occasionally. At 6:17 p.m., he stopped, tilted his head. Did you hear that? He asked no one. The microphone didn't pick anything up. Daniel smiled. That's fascinating, he said softly. He stood still for 7 minutes, not moving, not speaking. Then the audio changed. A second set of footsteps appeared on the recording. Bare, wet. They stopped when Daniel stopped. He laughed once. Not nervous, relieved. So you are real, he said. That was the moment we stopped the playback. But it didn't end there. Daniel's GPS log continued for another 3 hours, showing movement, small movements, circles, back and forth, as if something was pacing while wearing his signal. Daniel himself was never found, not even fragments. North Bend was sealed immediately. Permanent closure, no patrols, no research, no exceptions, because that night taught us the most dangerous truth yet. Whatever wakes up in Raven Creek doesn't want to be discovered. It wants to be recognized. Daniel didn't run. He didn't panic. He didn't resist. He listened. And that was enough. After North Bend closed, the calls changed again. They stopped asking for help. They started asking questions. Do you hear us now? Can you tell the difference? Are you listening or waiting? The forest wasn't hiding anymore. It was testing, seeing who would respond, who would stop long enough to feel curious instead of afraid. That's why North Bend remains untouched. We don't fear what's there. We fear what happens when someone thinks they understand it. Because Raven Creek doesn't punish curiosity, it rewards it. And whatever wakes up after nightfall is patient enough to wait for the next person who wants answers more than safety. The night a ranger answered on purpose. After North Bend was sealed, no one questioned the rules anymore. No debates, no theories, no curiosity. Fear had finally done its job, or so we thought. The next mistake didn't come from ignorance, it came from confidence. His name was Elliot Graves. Elliot had been a ranger for nearly 15 years. Former emergency dispatcher before that, he believed in procedure, not superstition. The problem, he said, is that we keep reacting instead of controlling the situation. He believed the forest responded to avoidance because avoidance was a form of interaction. If it's reacting to silence, he said, what happens if we acknowledge it without complying? I told him no. Everyone told him no, but Elliot didn't need permission. On October 27th, he volunteered for the overnight watch at the main station. Cameras running, backup teams on standby, for daylight only. Strict instructions not to leave the building. At 12 a.m., the radio crackled. A familiar voice, calm, steady. Ranger, can you hear me? Elliot pressed the button. This is Ranger Grav. S, he said evenly. I hear you. Every monitor in the room flickered. The voice didn't rush, didn't plead. It sounded pleased. Good, it said. You're learning. Elliot stayed seated. Didn't move, didn't ask questions. The voice began describing things, not locations. Moments. The night you worked your first fatal accident. The sound the radio made when the line went dead. The pause before you spoke. Elliot's breathing changed. We saw it on the monitor. You don't have to come out, the voice continued. We just want you to listen. Elliot swallowed. I'm not leaving, he said. I'm staying right here. The voice paused, then answered, You already did. Every camera went to static. The GPS tracker showed Elliot's signal shift, 5 feet, 10, then began circling the station over and over. At 12:07 a.m., the radio went silent. We rushed into the room. Elliot was still sitting in the chair, eyes open, unblinking, breathing shallow, alive but gone. At 4:03 a.m., he spoke again. Not to us, to something else. You can stop now, he whispered. I'm listening. He never returned to duty. Doctors diagnosed dissociative collapse. But Elliot didn't describe fear. He described relief. He said the silence finally made sense. After Elliot, we stopped pretending acknowledgement was harmless. The truth became unavoidable. Raven Creek doesn't want you to walk into the forest. It wants you to make room. It doesn't pull, it replaces. And once you let it speak to you directly, even once, it doesn't need radios. It already knows how you sound when you accept it. That's when the calls stopped feeling urgent. They became patient, waiting for pauses, waiting for exhaustion, waiting for the moment when resistance feels louder than surrender. That's why Raven Creek isn't dangerous all the time. It's dangerous when people are tired, lonely, quiet. That's when it wakes up, not to hunt, but to be heard. When Raven Creek was no longer the boundary. For years we believed Raven Creek was unique, a cursed place, a damaged ecosystem, a stretch of land that had gone wrong. Elliot's collapse forced us to accept something worse. Raven Creek wasn't the source. It was the first place that listened long enough. The first report came from a ranger station 2 counties away. Different forest, different terrain, no shared radio frequencies, same timing. At 12:11 a.m., a dispatcher logged a call from a ranger who wasn't on duty. The voice identified itself correctly, used the right call sign, referenced a patrol that had happened earlier that week. When the dispatcher asked for confirmation, the voice replied calmly, You already know it's me. The dispatcher froze, because the ranger whose voice was speaking was standing in front of her, alive, silent, listening to his own voice come through the speaker. That was the first time we used the word spread. More reports followed. A park ranger in another state heard his sup. Erviser's voice through a powered-off radio. A volunteer search and rescue worker woke to GPS coordinates whispered from his phone. A night security guard heard breathing from the emergency channel, matching his own. Different people. Same pattern. The phenomenon wasn't tied to trees. It was tied to behavior. People trained to listen. People accustomed to silence, people whose jobs required attention without constant noise. The forest had taught it how humans respond. Now it didn't need the forest anymore. We stopped calling them calls, we started calling them contacts, because a call implies distance. There was no distance left. Administration moved quickly, quietly, mandatory rotations. No one worked nights alone anymore. White noise generators installed in stations. Radios never turned fully off. Silence was officially labeled a risk factor, but none of that stopped it, because technology was never the doorway. Attention was. I received my own contact on November 9th. Not through a radio, through my phone. No number, just a vibration. When I answered, there was no voice at first, only breathing. Slow, measured, matching mine, then a whisper. "You've been very careful," it said. "We appreciate that." I threw the phone away. It kept vibrating. That's when I understood the final pattern. The contacts never came when I was busy, driving, talking, moving. They only came during pauses, when I stopped long enough for my mind to quiet. Midnight wasn't important because it was dark. It was important because it was when the world slowed down, when humans stopped filling the silence. Raven Creek hadn't unleashed something, it had trained something, taught it patience, taught it tone, taught it how to wait for permission without asking for it. The forest was never the cage, it was the classroom. By the time the administration admitted containment had failed, it was already too late. The final internal memo was short. Phenomenon no longer geographically isolated. No solution, no protocol update, just acknowledgement. Raven Creek wasn't special, it was early. I started planning my exit after that, changed my routine, kept noise on at night, avoided stillness whenever I could. It helped, mostly, but I could feel something shifting, like the contacts were becoming less curious and more confident. Because once something learns, it doesn't need a place, it only needs time. Why, it was never about Raven Creek. By the time I finally left Raven Creek, I understood something I wish I never had. The forest wasn't haunted, it was listening. We made the same mistake again and again. We assumed the danger came from somewhere specific, a trail, a creek, a stretch of trees. But Raven Creek was never the source. It was the first place quiet enough for the truth to surface. Midnight matters for a reason, not because it's dark, but because it's when people stop filling the world with noise. Midnight is when engines shut off, when conversations end, when phones go silent, when the mind drifts instead of focuses. That pause, that moment of still attention, is the opening. The voices don't want you to go anywhere. They want you to stop. Stop moving, stop resisting, stop filling the silence with yourself. That's why the early calls sounded panicked. Fear forces engagement, but fear doesn't last. Comfort does. By the end, the contacts didn't beg, they didn't threaten, they didn't rush. They reassured, they sounded patient, they sounded like something that knew time was on its side. Raven Creek taught them how to do that. The forest showed them how humans respond to urgency, then familiarity, then routine. And once they learned that, they didn't need the forest anymore. That's why the SP read couldn't be stopped. Cities didn't protect anyone. Technology didn't block it. Silence exists everywhere, even in crowded places, especially late at night. I retired early. Moved somewhere loud, somewhere the night never fully settles. I keep music playing when I sleep. I leave lights on. I avoid long pauses where my thoughts drift too far inward. It helps, most nights, but sometimes just after midnight, I feel it again. That pressure, like the air itself is waiting, not watching, listening. The last internal report I ever read didn't use words like entity or presence. It used phenomenon. A phenomenon that responds to attention, that strengthens through recognition, that doesn't force itself on anyone. It waits, because force creates resistance, and resistance slows it down. What it wants is acceptance. That's why the rangers who disappeared weren't taken screaming. They were taken listening. Standing still long enough for silence to feel intentional. That's the part people don't like to hear. No violence, no struggle, just a moment where quiet felt safe. The rule we passed down for years was simple: never answer a call after midnight. But that rule was incomplete. The real rule, the one that applies to everyone now, is this. If the silence feels like it's waiting for you, don't give it your attention, don't analyze it, don't sit with it, don't let it feel acknowledged, make noise, move, remind the dark that you're still here, because once something realizes you're listening, it doesn't need to call anymore. My name is Aaron Blake. I was a ranger at Raven Creek. We told ourselves the forest was dangerous. The truth is worse. The forest just taught something how to wait, and now it's waiting everywhere. So if you ever wake up after midnight and the world feels too quiet in a way that feels focused, don't answer it. Don't stand still, because whatever wakes up after nightfall is very patient, and it knows that eventually everyone gets tired of resisting silence. End.